Hello again, YouTubers, on with SpongeBob 101 back here again on the SpongeBob channel with another Kamp Koral episode review video. Today we'll be covering episode 5, The Treasure of Kamp Koral and Camper Gary. So the synopsis states, SpongeBob and Patrick find buried treasure at camp, but Mr. Krabs becomes desperate to get his claws on it. Then, SpongeBob disguises Gary as a new camper to keep him safe from Mrs. Puff. So 2 very interesting episodes to get to today, and without further ado, let's begin. Okay, so episode 5A, The Treasure of Kamp Koral, starts off at the Kamp Koral General Store. SpongeBob and Patrick want to buy this chocolate bar here, but unfortunately they do not have money. So on the way out, they find this shovel, which Mr. Krabs claims as a mint condition pirate shovel. Right, so after they are dumped outside, they decide to look for pirate treasure or buried treasure. Patrick pulls up his underpants and draws a random map on it, starts running around. So they run into the woods. Eventually, Patrick slams himself into a tree and falls on the ground or on the sand, right? And that creates an X-like shape on the sand, which SpongeBob thinks is a X that marks the spot. So they start digging, and surprisingly, there is buried treasure underneath there. Or at least, somehow Patrick found a giant treasure chest. And inside that giant treasure chest is a whole ton of money. So SpongeBob and Patrick are elated, and they decide that they can now buy anything. So they head back to the general store. Mr. Krabs, as you can see, is really excited to get money. And they purchased that Ultimate Chocolate Crunch Bar. So Mr. Krabs here, a lot of different animations that are really cool featuring Mr. Krabs in this episode. Like this one, the vacuum cleaner using his eye stalks. Alright, so they eat the Ultimate Chocolate Crunch Bar. There's a crunch cloud. Mr. Krabs recommends them to buy more stuff, and they do. So they buy lots of stuff, and eventually they kind of run out of space to put all of it. But they still have lots of cash. So Mr. Krabs proposes that they purchase the deluxe camping experience. The first portion of it is the walk down the red carpet. You can see SpongeBob here, very posh, right? And also Patrick has fingers. Then they go to the outhouse where Mr. Krabs is like the butler, and he uses this perfume, Camper's Discretion. I thought this was really funny as well. And so they pay him as they go out, and Patrick eats that bowl of blue stuff that Mr. Krabs is holding. I'm not sure if those are mint or what they are. Comment box below if you guys know. So then it goes on to archery, do a whole barrage of it, and Mr. Krabs ends up being pounded with all the plunger arrows. Alright, but okay, so next up, it's time for lunch. And instead of allowing Plankton to serve up slop to SpongeBob and Patrick, Mr. Krabs serves up ice cream, pancakes, shake, and donuts. And of course, SpongeBob and Patrick also have platters of cash ready for Mr. Krabs. And then next up, we have the hike to Porpoise Peak. If I'm not wrong, Porpoise Peak is essentially the same thing that we saw in Pineapple RV, where the warbling water lily is located. I think. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it is the one. And so Mr. Krabs brings up this wheelbarrow so that the two of them don't have to walk all the way up to the top. It is money operated though, so they had to put in cash into Mr. Krabs's note slot in the back, on his back. And then once that is done, he is on duty and he rushes up Porpoise Peak. So actually very nice animation here. Although I do want to point out, since this is the kelp forest, it doesn't really look like the trees are kelp. It reminds me more of the forest that we saw in the episode Bummer Vacation in season 4. So anyways, they go all the way to the top, of course, and the Porpoise Peak is somehow located or situated near Bikini Atoll. How did we not notice that before, right? So unfortunately, in a fit of excitement, they cause the wheelbarrow to roll backwards and down the mountain. So Mr. Krabs is frantically trying to catch up and get hold of them again. And so we also see this cameo of that monster that was in the first episode in Jellyfish Kid. Right, so they return to the base of the mountain, very happy to campers here. And although Mr. Krabs is exhausted, SpongeBob and Patrick want to pay for rides for the rest of the kids, which you can see here. And so you can see this can here. Mr. Krabs consumes it as if he's consuming spinach like Popeye. And he become strong again, essentially. So look at this. He's got muscles made of money. Hilarious. Okay, so anyways, the rides continue all the way till the next day. And after that, we see SpongeBob and Patrick just chilling on these beach chairs. And they ran out of money to pay for the rides hours ago. So Mr. Krabs was like inflamed, all right? But anyways, yeah, he falls apart and he just goes back. And then finally, we see Mr. Krabs going to his his basement in his cabin to join his new money with his old money. This is when he realizes that his old money is gone through this hole. So he climbs through the tunnel and he emerges at the spot where SpongeBob and Patrick found the treasure chest. So it turns out that it was Mr. Krabs' own money in the first place. He decides to find a new burying spot for it. Unfortunately, for some reason, he didn't do his scouting properly because this spot is literally on the edge of a cliff. I mean, really? Could he not have noticed that there was a cliff there? So unfortunately, the money falls right through and through the cliff, and it is blown by the wind into the camp. So Mr. Krabs thinks that this is when all of the campers' allowances have come in, but unfortunately, it is round 2 of kids using his own money to make him work. So yeah, overall, I'll give this episode a 8.5 out of 10. I think it was a really funny and silly episode. Not very serious, obviously, but it's a good way to approach the topic of money. And I think this, with regards to money, I think this episode far outshines the episode Porous Pockets in season 6. Now, it was a lesson of friendship in that episode, but in this case, SpongeBob and Patrick are somewhat more responsible with it and even quite generous. So I gotta give it to them. This episode is great, and yeah, comment down below what do you think about this episode. But without further ado, let's move on. Episode 5B, Camper Gary, is the first time we see Gary in Kamp Koral. So anyways, Gary wakes up in the morning. He's kind of hungry and he tries to eat this bug, which is pretty strong, so he fails to do so. Gary then stumbles upon Mrs. Puff's garden. He spots these tomatoes and is kind of excited to eat it. And then meanwhile, Mrs. Puff shows up to collect some fresh vegetables for the upcoming Kamp Koral Picnic. She then finds Gary and freaks out, of course. So she puffs up and then she chases after Gary because she thinks Gary is a pest. There is a scene where Mrs. Puff rolls through this tent with the legs and the kid on the other side. I thought it was pretty funny. So when they went through it, you can see 2 kids actually are in there. You know, a reference to a magic trick, essentially. Anyways, Gary finds refuge in the dingy cabin where SpongeBob is, of course. So this is where SpongeBob, of course, reunites with Gary. He does say that he hasn't seen Gary since last summer. And this is when Mrs. Puff bursts into the cabin with a chainsaw. I mean, that's kind of dangerous, don't you think? And she notices this trail of liquid on the floor, and Mrs. Puff pulls up Patrick. So it turns out that Patrick was creating the drool and it wasn't snail slime after all. So Patrick even takes Mrs. Puff's chainsaw and uses and hugs it as he sleeps. So very funny. Mrs. Puff, of course, gives SpongeBob a grave warning that that she would turn Gary into escargot if she found him, and leaves the cabin. So of course Gary is super afraid, and SpongeBob tries to rationalize the situation and decides to protect Gary at all costs, right? So he gets some help from Sandy, who decides to, of course, I mean, seeing how crazy Mrs. Puff is, as you can see here, confronting Bubble Bass, she decides to hide Gary in plain sight. And this means making Gary a fellow camper. So far so good, but unfortunately they come across Mr. Krabs, who starts getting a little bit suspicious because Gary, does not have a kerchief, right? So Patrick almost blurts out that Gary is Gary, but then of course Patrick does then attach his own kerchief to Gary, and all's good. At least they think. Unfortunately, because now Patrick doesn't have a kerchief, Mr. Krabs kicks him out for being a non-paying camper of all things. So poor Patrick. Let's move on. So it is time for the Kamp Koral Picnic to begin though. So they kind of totally forget of the task of getting Gary out of Kamp Koral before Mrs. Puff can catch him. And instead they go and participate in the picnic. So the first step is this four-legged race. And somehow they managed to win it. And then the second challenge here is the eating competition, and Gary is visibly excited about all the good vegetables that he is about to eat. In fact, he doesn't want just his serving, he wants all of their servings. So yeah, very funny. And as you can see here, Gary is stuffed with vegetables in his mouth. So Mrs. Puff is also quite happy that Gary likes her vegetables. So the third part of the picnic is the picnic awards. The picnic award does go to Gary, of all things, and the prize is this trophy, which looks like a bunch of vegetables, right? So Gary thinks it is vegetables and wants to eat it, and unfortunately in the process he reveals his true identity, right? So this causes everyone to be in shock, as you can see, and Mrs. Puff is ready to use her salt shaker to salt Gary. So the chase ensues, and all the way to through the woods, and then Gary goes aside. Mrs. Puff is a bit like, wait, what? And Mrs. Puff goes right off the cliff, as you can see here. So she's just hanging off a ledge of the cliff. There's no one to save her, or so she thinks, because Gary actually uses his snail slime to create a lasso. He does rescue Mrs. Puff, and successfully as well, which is really cool. And I'm surprised that a small little snail can actually pull up and a puffer fish. Anyways, SpongeBob finally catches up with them, and Mrs. Puff praises Gary for saving her. So yeah, everyone's friends with each other. Very silly part where Gary licks SpongeBob and then SpongeBob licks Gary back. Ew. So the episode ends with a after picnic luau, where Mrs. Puff thanks Gary for saving her, and everyone has vegetables to eat from the garden. Yay! And of course Gary is sitting on the far end there. But at the same time, we have Patrick, who snuck back into Kamp Koral, and he really wants to eat all the veggies, right? So Mr. Krabs is furious and wants to kick Patrick out for trying to get free stuff. And Miss Patrick's like, I don't want anything. I don't want free stuff. I just want food for free. And I thought this was a very cute and funny moment. Mr. Krabs goes crazy and goes on a rampage trying to kick Patrick out again. So yeah, overall I give this episode a 7.5 out of 10. It's a great way to introduce Gary, by the way. And also I think the way Mrs. Puff was so obsessed with trying to hunt down Gary was also quite interesting. You know, it gave the episode the punch it needed. So yeah, overall it's a pretty good episode. The only thing I really didn't like about this episode is, of course, the part where Mr. Krabs is so desperate to kick out Patrick. I mean, the previous episode, he knew that underwear belonged to Patrick, even though that underwear didn't have Patrick's name on it. So yeah, that's kind of strange, right? So yeah, that's not great. And of course, the way SpongeBob and Sandy treated Patrick, just like dumping him, in favor of Gary. I mean, they could have just gone out together. And why couldn't Patrick have just gone back to the cabin and take a replacement kerchief? So yeah, those are my only concerns. But overall, these two episodes are pretty good. And yeah, comment in the box below, what do you guys think? Thank you guys for watching. Make sure to subscribe, like, favorite, comment, etc. Keep right here on Ultimate SpongeBob 101. And I'll see you guys in the next one for a review of episode 6. Bye!